You are not authorized to move these patients, Desmond Chase. We wait for county rescue. That's protocol.
County rescue is 30 minutes out on a good night. This isn't a good night.
You don't have medical clearance to be doing this.
I've got a stopwatch in my head telling me this hallway's underwater in 12 minutes. You want to argue procedure? Argue it walking.
If something happens to her because you moved her wrong...
Something's gonna happen to her if nobody moves her at all. I need you calling out names and room numbers. I need you telling me who can hold their own head up and who can't. That's the job right now. Can you do that job?
For a second, Yolanda just stood there, radio in one hand, dispatch on the other end, still saying words like staging and as soon as we're able. Then something in her face shifted and she grabbed the clipboard off the nurse's station wall and started moving with him. Room 6, she said. Mr. Okafor, right side's weak from a stroke. He can't grip anything. Then I carry him first pass. Desmond set the woman down on the dry landing at the far stairwell, checked her pulse once more, and turned back into the water. Talk to me the whole way. I need to hear what you're seeing, not just what's on his chart. Yolanda followed him back down the hall, and by the second doorway, she wasn't fighting him anymore. She was calling out vitals like she'd done this before, even though neither of them had. Who taught you to talk like that, she asked, watching him press 2 fingers to Mr. Okafor's wrist, count silently, and adjust his grip before lifting. Checking pulse like that, calling out numbers under your breath, that's not maintenance training. Not now, Yolanda. I'm not asking to make conversation. I'm asking because I need to know if you know what you're doing. Desmond didn't answer that either. He got his arms fully under Mr. Okafor and started back toward the stairwell, water sloshing at mid-thigh now, rising faster than either of them wanted to say out loud. The third trip belonged to a man named Wendell Gray, 90 years old, who gripped Desmond's collar the entire way down the hall and kept repeating quietly that he'd survived a flood before in a different country, a different decade, and hadn't planned on doing it twice. Desmond didn't have breath to answer him. He just kept moving, and Wendell kept talking, and somewhere in that back and forth neither of them noticed the water climbing past Desmond's hips. By the fourth trip, the hallway lights had gone from flickering to gone, and Desmond was working by the beam of a headlamp clipped to a maintenance vest that had never been built for this. Yolanda had stopped questioning him and started anticipating him, calling out which rooms still had someone inside before he even asked. 5 left, she said. Water's past my waist in 9 and 10. I can't get to them alone. Then we're not going one at a time anymore. Desmond looked down the black corridor, doing math nobody had trained him to do in a maintenance uniform. Give me the 2 who can hold on to a rail if I get them upright. I'll come back for the ones who can't. Desmond, say it later. He was already moving. Hod got 2 more out, holding onto a length of PVC conduit he'd braced across the worst of the current, walking them hand over hand toward the stairwell while Yolanda steadied them from behind. 6, 7. The 7th was Louise Kemp, 81 years old, gripping his forearm hard enough to leave marks, saying nothing the whole way because she'd decided somewhere in that hallway that talking would slow him down. He turned back for the 8th person exactly as the ceiling panel over the east junction gave way, and 6 feet of standing water became 11 feet of collapsed hallway in under a minute, black water closing over the doorways of rooms 8, 9, and 10 before he'd covered half the distance. Desmond stood in that water for a long moment after, not moving, listening to nothing where there should have been 3 more voices. Yolanda found him there. She didn't say anything about protocol. She just stood next to him in water that had stopped rising and started, instead, to settle into something final. Who was in 9 and 10, Desmond asked, not because he didn't know, but because saying the names out loud felt like the only thing left that was still his to do. Doris Fain, Harold Cho, and Mr. Okafor's roommate, Desmond, Pete Anders. He never made it back to his own bed after the first move. He was still in the hallway chair when... Yolanda stopped herself, pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth for a second, and started again, steadier. 3, it's 3. It should have been 10. It wasn't. She said it flatly, like a fact she needed him to hold on to before the state got a chance to hand him a different one. It was 3 because of you. Don't let anybody talk you out of that math before the sun's even up. By the time the ambulances arrived, Desmond had moved from the parking structure to the triage tarps laid out along the dry curb, checking on the 7 one more time out of habit rather than necessity, because none of the paramedics working that line had any reason to trust a maintenance technician's read on vitals yet. Mr. Okafor caught his sleeve as they loaded him onto a gurney. "You came back for me first," he said, voice thick with exhaustion. "I felt that arm and I knew somebody who actually knew what they were doing had me. Just doing the job in front of me." "No." Okafor's grip tightened, weak but certain. "I've had physical therapists who didn't move me as careful as you did. Don't let anybody convince you that wasn't skill." Desmond didn't have an answer for that yet. He just nodded and let the paramedics take over and stood there a long moment watching the last of the 7 disappear into the back of an ambulance before Wendell Gray, 3 gurneys down, called out that he still owed him the rest of that story about the first flood someday when there was time. Dawn came gray and wrong over Cedar Crest Manor, and by the time the first state vehicle pulled into the flooded lot, 7 survivors sat wrapped in blankets on the dry side of the parking structure, and 3 families had not yet been told anything at all. Marta Farrow got out of that vehicle already reading a printout, and the first thing she said to Desmond Reeves, before "Are you hurt?" before "Thank you," was, "Who authorized you to be handling patients?" "Nobody," Desmond said. There wasn't time to ask. Farrow's eyes moved from him to the waterline still visible on the building's brick, then back to him. And something in her face closed like a door being locked from the inside. "We're going to need a full statement," she said. "Today." By the next morning, Desmond understood exactly what kind of statement she meant. The story broke before noon. State official, unlicensed workers' unauthorized actions contributed to 3 deaths at Cedar Crest Manor. Farrow stood at a podium with the state seal behind her, reading from prepared remarks, calling Desmond's actions a serious deviation from established emergency protocol and a decision that was not his to make. Cedar Crest suspended him within the hour and delivered a notice barring him from the property, citing an active investigation. A state attorney's office confirmed it was reviewing the incident for potential charges, including criminal negligence. Pete Anders's daughter found him outside the funeral home 2 days later, before the service had even started, before Desmond had worked up the nerve to decide whether he had any right to be there at all. "You're him," she said. Her name was Renata Anders Cole, and grief had worn a specific exhausted edge into her voice. "You're the one who decided my father could wait. I didn't decide that easily. I want you to know that. I don't care how you decided it. I care that you did." Her hands were shaking, not from anger exactly, but from something with anger folded inside a dozen other things. He was in a hallway chair. He was right there. That's what they told us at the state's family briefing, that you walked past him twice. "I checked him twice," Desmond said quietly. "Both times, by the training I have, there were people I could get out faster with a better chance. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that was an easy thing to watch myself do. It wasn't. But I'm also not going to lie to you and say I'd have done it differently with the same 4 minutes and the same water." Renata's eyes were wet, and for a moment she didn't say anything at all. "The state's saying you had no right to make that call. They're right that I shouldn't have had to. I've asked myself every hour since why there weren't 3 more nurses in that building who could have split that hallway with me. I don't have a good answer yet. When I do, you're going to be the first person I tell, before any reporter, before anybody in a suit." She didn't forgive him there on the sidewalk in a black dress that still had raindrops on the shoulders. She just looked at him for a long moment, then walked past him into the funeral home without another word, and Desmond stood outside in the cold a long time before he made himself leave. Julian found the news on his phone before Desmond had a chance to explain it himself. "Dad, it says you might go to jail." His son's voice was flat in the way of someone trying very hard not to sound scared. "For saving people?" "It's more complicated than the headline." "Then uncomplicate it for me." Desmond sat down across from him at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a coffee mug he wasn't drinking from. 3 people died last night that I couldn't get to in time. The state's saying that's on me because I wasn't supposed to be the one deciding who got moved first. Were you supposed to just let more people die waiting? That's not how they're going to ask the question. Julian didn't have an answer for that, and Desmond didn't have a better one to give him. They sat there a long time without talking, the way people do when the thing that needs saying doesn't have a shape yet. At school that week, Julian sat through a class discussion. Of all things, current events, where a boy 2 rows over pulled up the story on his phone under the desk and read the headline out loud in a low voice meant to carry exactly as far as Julian's seat. Julian didn't say anything back. He just stared at the whiteboard until the bell rang, then walked home instead of taking the bus because he didn't want to answer any questions from anyone for 45 minutes. Local talk radio picked the story up by the third day, and Desmond made the mistake of listening to 15 minutes of it in his truck outside the pharmacy. Half the callers wanted him prosecuted. The other half wanted to know why a facility with the state's own seal of approval hadn't had enough staff to keep anyone from needing to be carried out of a hallway in the first place. Nobody on either side of that argument had all the facts yet, and Desmond turned the radio off before he heard his own name mispronounced a third time. Over the following days, Desmond kept the television off and answered the door for no one, but on the fourth evening, Yolanda knocked anyway, out of uniform, no clipboard this time. "I need to ask you something, and I need you not to lie to me," she said, standing on his porch like she wasn't sure she was welcome. "The way you moved that night, the way you talked. That wasn't a facilities guy improvising. Where did you actually learn to do triage?" Desmond stood there a moment, weighing how much of this he was ready to let inside his house. Then he pushed the screen door open and stepped aside without a word, which was answer enough. Inside, over coffee. Neither of them touched. Yolanda laid out what she'd been sitting with for 4 days. "I've been a nurse for 11 years. I know what trained hands look like under pressure, and yours were trained. I want to know why a maintenance technician has hands like that, and I want to know before the state decides the answer for both of us." "Army," Desmond said finally, "Special Forces Medic, 18 Delta. For how long?" 12 years, multiple deployments." He turned the mug slowly on the table. "I did real triage before, Yolanda. Combat triage. The kind where you have 4 minutes and 11 people and you have to decide, fast, who has time and who doesn't. I got good at it. Good enough that command trusted me to make that call more than once. That's not something to be ashamed of. One of those times, I was right about the math and wrong about the man." Desmond's voice had gone quieter, harder to keep steady. "A guy under my care that day, wounds weren't survivable by the numbers I'd been trained to trust. I moved past him to reach 2 men I thought I could save. He died alone while I was working on someone else 40 feet away. I've replayed that decision more nights than I can count, and every single time the math still says I did it right. That's the part nobody tells you. Being right doesn't mean it stops costing you something." Yolanda didn't offer him anything easy because there wasn't anything easy to offer. "So when Pharaoh's office says you had no business making those choices, they're right that I shouldn't have had to." Desmond looked up at her. "I left the Army so I'd never have to make that call again. I took a job fixing generators specifically because nobody's life depends on whether I read a situation correctly. And then a wing full of people I'd said good morning to for 2 years started drowning, and it turned out I never actually put that part of myself down. I just stopped telling people I still had it. Does Pharaoh know any of this? Not from me. She's going to find out. I know." Yolanda sat with that for a moment, then reached into her bag and set a folded sheet of paper on the table between them. A photocopy, corners soft from handling. Before you decide how much of yourself you're willing to hand her, there's something you should see first. Desmond unfolded it. A memo, 6 months old, on state letterhead, outlining new staffing minimums for licensed long-term care facilities. A reduction, not an increase, from 4 overnight nurses to 1 at facilities under a certain bed count. Cedar Crest qualified. The signature at the bottom belonged to Marta Pharaoh. "The second pump," Desmond said slowly. "The backup one that never got fixed after it went down in the spring. Capital repair budget got frozen the same quarter, same office, same signature." Yolanda tapped the page. "I've been carrying it in my bag 6 months, shift to shift, like something that might go off. I'm done carrying it." In her office 2 floors below the governor's own suite, Marta Pharaoh spent that same week fielding calls she didn't take notes on. The governor's chief of staff wanted assurance that the budget office's name wouldn't surface in connection with any facility's equipment failures. Her own deputy reminded her more than once that her nomination hearing for state health commissioner was 5 weeks away, and that hearings had a way of finding exactly the kind of story a maintenance worker with a hidden military record made for. Pharaoh had spent 11 years building a reputation as the person in state government who could cut a budget without anyone noticing what got cut, and she believed genuinely that the alternative to her staffing directive wasn't more nurses. It was fewer facilities able to stay licensed at all, more residents with no beds anywhere. She had told herself that story so many times it no longer felt like a story. It felt like math, the same as Desmond's, except nobody was going to ask her to explain hers out loud in a hallway with the water still rising. 2 days later, a lawyer representing the state's interest requested a private meeting with Desmond. Not Farrow herself, but close enough that her fingerprints were all over the offer that followed. If Desmond would sign a statement acknowledging he'd acted outside his authority and accept a civil finding rather than contest anything, the criminal referral would likely be dropped quietly before it ever reached a grand jury. "That sounds like a good deal," the lawyer said, sliding the paper across the table. "No trial, no headlines about a possible conviction. Your record stays clean of anything criminal. And in exchange, I sign a paper saying I acted outside my authority. A civil acknowledgement, nothing more. It sounds like a deal for someone who isn't planning on anyone finding out about a staffing memo," Desmond said. The lawyer's expression didn't change, which told Desmond everything he needed to know about whether Farrow had expected him to already know. "I don't know anything about a memo," the lawyer said too evenly. "Then you'll find out at the same time everyone else does." Desmond stood, leaving the unsigned paper flat on the table between them. 7 people are alive because of what happened that night, Desmond said. "I'm not putting my signature on a piece of paper that trades that fact away just so somebody's budget line stays clean." He walked out without waiting for a response. 2 days after that, Louise Kemp sat up in her hospital bed, waved off the nurse trying to adjust her pillows, and told a local reporter exactly what she thought, unprompted and unedited by anyone's press office. "Young man carried me through water up to his chest," she said, looking straight at the camera instead of at the reporter's notepad. "I taught 5th grade for 31 years. I know the difference between a man who's reckless and a man who's terrified and doing the math anyway. That man was doing the math. You want to charge somebody with a crime? Go find whoever decided this building only needed 1 nurse a night." It didn't end the story. It complicated it, which was its own kind of progress. Yolanda didn't go to a newspaper. She walked her memo into the office of the state inspector general 4 days later, gave a sworn statement, and asked what would happen next. What happened next was slow, procedural, and entirely outside Marta Farrow's chain of command. An independent audit opened not because a reporter had asked a hard question, but because a nurse had put a document in front of investigators whose job existed specifically to check whether people like Farrow were telling the truth. Desmond's military service record surfaced during that audit, not because he offered it, but because investigators pulled every credential and background file connected to the incident as a matter of routine. For the first time, what he'd told Yolanda in his kitchen existed on paper, signed by the United States Army instead of by his own memory. Desmond gave his own statement to the investigating panel the following week, in a conference room with a single recorder on the table and no cameras allowed. Farrow sat 2 seats down the same table, there to answer questions of her own, and for the first time since the flood, the 2 of them were in the same room without a podium or a lawyer standing between them. "Mr. Reeves," the lead investigator said, "walk us through how you decided the order of extraction." "Airway, then perfusion, then how much time each move would cost me," Desmond said. "Standard field triage. I didn't invent it for that night. I've used it before, under worse conditions, with better resources." "And you didn't consult facility protocol before beginning." Facility protocol was to wait for county rescue. County rescue was 30 minutes out, with 2 boats instead of the 4 they'd have had before this office cut water rescue funding last year. Desmond didn't look at Farrow when he said it, but he didn't look away from her direction either. "I made a call because the alternative was watching people drown while we followed a plan that assumed help that wasn't coming." Farrow's attorney objected to the characterization. The investigator let it stand. When it was her turn, Farrow answered every question in careful, complete sentences that never once used the word cut. She called the staffing directive a rebalancing of resources consistent with statewide capacity planning, and the pump repair freeze a temporary capital deferral pending budget reconciliation. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Desmond watched her do to language exactly what she'd trained herself to do to a spreadsheet, and understood for the first time that she probably believed every word of it. He told Julian the rest of it that same week, sitting on the back steps instead of at the kitchen table, like the story needed more room than 4 walls could give it. There was a day, Desmond said, where I had to choose, fast, who I could save and who I couldn't. I got it right by the numbers. A man died anyway because I moved on to people I thought had a better chance. I've never stopped thinking about him. Julian was quiet for a while. Is that why you never told anyone here what you used to do? I told myself I was just being modest. Truth is, I didn't want to ever be the guy making that call again, and then I had to be him anyway, in a flooded hallway with people I actually knew this time. Would you do it the same way, if you could go back? Desmond thought about that honestly, the way he'd been forcing himself to all week. I'd get to room 9 faster if I could. I don't know how, given the water, given the time, but I'd want to. I can't tell you I'd change the order I chose, because I still think it was the order that saved the most people. That doesn't mean it doesn't sit heavy. The math can be right and the weight still comes due. There's no column on any tag for that. Julian leaned into his shoulder, not saying anything else, and Desmond let him. 2 weekends later, Desmond drove out to the rehabilitation center where Wendell Gray had been recovering, mostly because a promise made in a flooded hallway had been sitting on his conscience the way unfinished things do. Wendell was sitting up in a chair by the window, sharper than the last time Desmond had seen him. You came back to hear the rest of that story, Wendell said, like no time had passed at all. You said you owed it to me. I did, Wendell gestured at the second chair. Sit, this one takes a while, and I intend to tell it right. I told it. A river crossing decades earlier, half a world away, a much younger version of himself carried across churning water by a soldier whose name he'd never learned and had spent 70 years wishing he had. I didn't get his name, Wendell said at the end of it. I got yours. I intend to use it every chance I get, whether the state likes it or not. Desmond didn't have a way to answer that without his voice cracking, so he didn't try. He just sat with Wendell a while longer, in a room that smelled like antiseptic and spring air through a cracked window, and let an old man's gratitude do the work his own words couldn't. A week after his session with the panel, Desmond drove to the VA clinic 2 towns over for the first time in almost a decade, sat in a waiting room full of men and women who understood the particular math he'd been running in his head without needing it explained, and told a counselor named Dr. Prescott the whole story from the beginning, the river crossing in another country, the man he'd had to leave, the hallway, the number 7, the number 3. You keep saying the math was right, Dr. Prescott said, like that settles it. Doesn't it? It settles whether you made a defensible decision. It doesn't settle whether you get to carry the cost of it alone for the rest of your life. She let that sit a moment. You did this twice now, Desmond. Once in uniform, once in a hallway with people you knew by name. You don't have to keep proving to yourself you did it right. You already know you did. What you haven't done yet is let yourself grieve the 3 you couldn't reach without treating that grief like evidence against you. He didn't have an answer for her that day, but he came back the following week and the week after that, and somewhere in that slow, unglamorous work, he found a place to put the weight down that wasn't a courtroom or a headline or his own son's shoulder. 3 weeks into the audit, Farrow requested a private session with the investigating team, and when that didn't slow anything down, she made a call to Cedar Crest's ownership group suggesting that certain employees speaking outside proper channels might jeopardize the facility's licensing status going forward. A warning aimed squarely at Yolanda, delivered sideways enough to avoid a direct paper trail. Farrow called Yolanda directly 2 days after that, her tone warm, almost maternal, the kind of warmth that only shows up right before a threat. I just want to make sure you understand the position you're putting yourself in, Farrow said. Facilities lose licenses over far smaller things than an employee freelancing with confidential internal documents. It's not confidential, it's a staffing directive with your signature on it. It's a draft that was never fully implemented the way people are characterizing it. I was the one nurse on that floor the night it flooded, Yolanda said. It was implemented plenty. Farrow didn't have anything to say to that, and the call ended a few seconds later without either woman saying goodbye. Yolanda told Desmond about the call the same night she got it. She's trying to scare me into going quiet. Are you going quiet? I've had one job since that night that mattered to me, and it wasn't nursing shifts. Yolanda's jaw was tight. I already gave the OIG a full statement on the record. I'm not walking any of it back because somebody with a bigger title made a phone call. She confirmed the memo's contents formally before the investigating panel 2 days later on the record under her own name with Cedar Crest's ownership group sitting in the room. The following week brought a red flag warning nobody wanted to see. A second major storm system, tracking straight for Dutton County, arriving the same week the Inspector General's team was scheduled for its final on-site walkthrough of Cedar Crest's East Wing. The second pump, promised repaired within 30 days, was still sitting disassembled in a maintenance closet, waiting on a part that hadn't been approved for purchase. Desmond heard about the storm from the news like everyone else, banned from a property he used to have keys to. He told himself he wasn't going to drive out there. He told himself that for exactly as long as it took the first flash flood alert to hit his phone, mentioning Cedar Crest by name. "Dad, you can't," Julian said, watching him grab his keys. "They banned you. If you go back there—" "I know what they said." "Then why—" "Because Louise Kemp is still in that building, and the pump that was supposed to be fixed isn't, and I already know exactly how fast that hallway floods." Desmond looked at his son and didn't dress it up. "I'm not doing this to prove I was right. I'm doing it because I know what's about to happen in there. And I'm the only person on this side of town who's done this before." Julian didn't try to stop him again. He just said, "Then I'm coming as far as the parking lot," in a voice that didn't leave room for argument, and Desmond, out of time to fight two battles at once, let him. The drive to Cedar Crest took 9 minutes. The water had already reached the access road by the time they arrived, and the inspection team's vehicles sat abandoned at odd angles near the entrance. Most of the staff and investigators already moved to higher ground, a temporary construction stairwell, rigged for the inspection. Visible through the front glass, still standing, still the only way down to the East Wing's lower level. The East Wing sat half a level below the main entrance, a 1970s add-on that had never been corrected, and ownership had moved residents back into it 3 weeks earlier. Upper floor first, lower level supposedly sealed until the IG's walkthrough finished, on the theory that empty beds don't bill. Desmond went in anyway. Inside, the East Wing was half-lit by emergency lighting, water already ankle-deep and rising along the same corridor he'd memorized 4 months earlier. Inspection tape still stretched across sections of wall that hadn't finished drying from the last flood before this one arrived. The lower level, official paperwork claimed, was empty. It wasn't. He found Louise Kemp exactly where he expected her, refusing to leave a hallway chair because the aide assigned to her had already evacuated 2 other residents and hadn't made it back. "Took you long enough," Louise said, not unkindly, gripping her cane like she'd been ready to use it on the water itself if he hadn't shown up. "Wasn't exactly cleared to be here. Good thing I never much cared what you were cleared for." She let him get an arm under her. "Move fast, young man. I'd like to not do this a third time." He got her up and moving toward the stairwell in under 2 minutes, faster than the water climbing behind them. The stairwell shuddered under their weight before they'd cleared the third step, a low groan of overstressed steel that Desmond recognized from a dozen structures that hadn't been built to survive what he was about to ask of them. He got Louise ahead of him anyway, one hand braced against her back, the other gripping the temporary railing hard enough to feel it flex. "Keep moving," he told her. "Don't stop for me, don't look back, just get to the landing." "What about you?" "I'm right behind you." I was 3 steps from the top when the temporary stairwell, never rated for the load, never meant to outlast a single inspection day, buckled under a support beam that had been standing in water too long, and a section of decking came down across his lower leg, pinning him half a step from the landing while Louise stumbled the rest of the way to safety on her own. Julian heard it from the parking lot. He was through the front doors before Yolanda, arriving late, having spent the last 20 minutes helping evacuate the West Wing before anyone told her the east side was flooding again, even reached the entrance. "Dad!" Julian's voice cracked over the sound of water hitting the walls. "Dad, I'm here! I'm right here! Stay back from the edge, the currents—" "I know, you told me. Keep 3 points of contact, don't fight the current straight on." Julian was already moving along the safer edge of the stairwell, the way he'd watched his father move 100 times without either of them calling it training. "Yolanda's coming, I called her, she's almost here." Yolanda arrived seconds later, breathing hard, and dropped to the debris, pinning Desmond's leg without wasting a word on questions. "Talk me through the leverage point, now. Brace under the beam, not the decking. The decking'll just crack more." Desmond's voice was tight with pain but steady, the same voice Julian had heard explaining a stuck bolt or a jammed pump 100 times before. "Julian, find something rigid, 4 feet anything. There's conduit stacked by the utility closet." Julian didn't ask why or argue the risk. He went, found a length of galvanized pipe, and came back faster than either adult expected, sliding it into the gap Yolanda had opened under the beam exactly where Desmond told him to. "On three," Desmond said. "Lean into it, don't yank." They leaned into it together, Yolanda and Julian on either end of the pipe, and the beam gave enough, just enough, for Desmond to pull his leg free and drag himself the last few feet up onto dry landing before the whole structure gave way completely behind them, water rushing through the space where he'd been pinned seconds before. For a moment none of them said anything. Julian was breathing hard, staring at his hands like he didn't fully understand what they'd just done. Desmond reached out and pulled him down into the kind of hug that didn't care about water or blood or the 12 years of things unsaid sitting behind it. "You did that," Desmond said, voice breaking for the first time in weeks. "You knew exactly what to do." "You taught me." Julian's voice was muffled against his father's shoulder. "Every Saturday. I didn't even know you were teaching me anything." When the county tallied what the second flood cost Cedar Crest, the number that mattered read differently than the first time. 3 residents evacuated, 1 sprained wrist, 0 dead. The Inspector General's final report was released 6 weeks later, and it did not need a single dramatic reveal to make its point, because the timeline did the work on its own. A staffing directive signed by Deputy Health Commissioner Marta Farrow that reduced overnight licensed nursing coverage at qualifying facilities. A capital repair freeze from the same office that left Cedar Crest's second emergency pump non-operational for over a year. A county water rescue response delayed by resource reductions tied to the same budget cycle. All 3, the report noted, traced back to a single appropriations line and a single signature. Farrow's own entered twice within the same fiscal quarter, once for the staffing cut and once for the capital freeze, a concentration of authority the panel called its most damning finding. And separately, a clinical review confirming that Desmond Reeves's triage decisions on the night of the flood were consistent with accepted mass casualty protocol, and that his actions were the direct reason 7 residents survived a collapse that, on the numbers alone, should have killed all 10. The criminal referral against him was withdrawn within days. Cedar Crest's ownership issued a formal reinstatement and an apology. He read, standing at the mailbox, and had folded back into its envelope before he reached the porch. Renata Anders Cole called him the same week the report went public and asked if he'd meet her at the cemetery instead of anywhere else. She was standing at her father's grave when he arrived, arms crossed against the spring wind. "I read the whole thing," she said without turning around. "The staffing memo, the pump, all of it." "I know. I spent 2 months being angry at the wrong person because the state made it easy to be angry at you instead of them." She finally looked at him. "I'm not going to pretend that makes losing him hurt less, but I don't want to be one more person who let them get away with pointing at you so nobody had to look at the memo. You don't owe me anything for figuring that out." "I know I don't." Renata wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, quick and almost angry at herself for it. "I just needed you to hear it from me instead of a headline. He was in a hallway chair. You checked him twice. Both times you were right that other people needed you more in that exact minute. That's not the same as you deciding he didn't matter. I know that now. I think some part of me knew it the day it happened and just couldn't afford to feel it yet." Desmond didn't try to fill the silence that followed. He just stood there with her at her father's grave for a while, 2 people who would never fully agree on how to carry that night, finding a small, imperfect peace anyway. Marta Farrow did not survive the report politically. Her nomination for state health commissioner was withdrawn without public explanation, and within a month she stood at a much smaller podium than the one she'd once used to blame a maintenance technician for her own budget line, and resigned from her deputy position altogether, citing personal reasons that convinced no one who had read the audit. She did not mention Cedar Crest by name. She did not have to. Every reporter in that room already knew exactly which 3 names belonged in the story she wasn't telling. The state legislature moved faster than anyone expected on the staffing question. Yolanda drove 3 hours to sit in the gallery the day the bill came up for its final vote and texted Desmond a single photo from her seat. The tally board, lit green almost top to bottom. New minimum ratio requirements for long-term care facilities passed within the same session, a law that people in Dutton County had already started calling, informally, the Cedar Crest Minimum, long before it had an official name. Yolanda herself left Cedar Crest for a state inspector position that spring, the kind of job that let her walk into any understaffed facility in the region and ask hard questions before a flood ever had the chance to ask them for her. She still called Desmond on the anniversary of that first night every year after just to say the number out loud, 7, so neither of them ever let it get soft around the edges. At school, the same boy who'd read the headline out loud under his desk found Julian by the lockers a week after the report broke and without much grace but with real effort said he'd been wrong and his dad had been wrong too and left it at that. Julian accepted it the way 12-year-olds accept most apologies, quickly, without making the other person suffer for it, already halfway thinking about something else. Cedar Crest reopened its east wing fully 2 months after the second flood, staffed this time at the new legal minimum instead of the old one. Both pumps replaced with units rated for twice the capacity anyone thought they'd ever need again. On a Sunday afternoon in early spring, Desmond and Julian walked the newly repainted East Wing hallway together, sunlight coming through windows that had been underwater 4 months earlier, and found Louise Kemp exactly where the staff said she'd be, holding court in the sunroom with 2 other residents who had not, this time, needed anyone to carry them anywhere. "There he is," Louise said, waving them over with the particular authority of a woman who had spent 30 years commanding a 5th-grade classroom and never quite stopped. And the young man who apparently learned everything his father knows. "Not everything," Julian said. "He still won't teach me how to fix the ice machine." "Some things a man keeps to himself," Desmond said, and it was the first joke he'd made in months that didn't feel like it cost him something. Later, on the drive home, Desmond reached into the glove compartment and came back with a small folded item he'd carried since his last deployment. A red triage tag, worn soft at the creases, unused, the kind clipped to a patient in the field to mark the order of care. "I want you to have this," he said, setting it in Julian's palm at a red light. "What is it?" "A triage tag. Red means treat first. I've carried a blank one since the day that man died on my watch. Never used it, just kept it as a reminder that speed costs something and slow costs something else. And there's no version of that math that lets you walk away clean." Desmond glanced over at him. "I'm not giving it to you so you carry the weight I've carried. I'm giving it to you because you already proved today you don't need the tag to know what matters first. You just went. That's rarer than the training. Don't let anyone talk you out of trusting it." "Dad," Julian said after a while, still turning the tag over between his fingers, "are you going to keep working there after everything?" "They offered me a different title. Facilities coordinator. Whole campus, not just nights." Desmond eased the truck around the bend where the guardrails still showed a faint waterline nobody had gotten around to repainting. "I told them I'd take it on one condition. They keep the staffing ratio the law requires, and they let me put in for the overnight generator inspections myself. Every storm season, no exceptions, no waivers. So you're still going to be the guy who checks if everything's going to hold. Somebody's got to be. Might as well be somebody who already knows what happens if it doesn't." Julian turned the tag over in his fingers one more time, reading the faded stamp on the back, and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he folded his hand around it and looked out at the road ahead, where the water had long since receded and the ditches along Averly Creek ran low and ordinary in the late afternoon light, as if nothing that serious had ever happened there at all.